I welcome all of you to the session of refractive surgery, basics of refractive surgery. And I invite Dr. Kavita Rao for workup for refractive surgery, addressing workup.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Are my slides visible? Are my slides visible?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much. So I'll be talking on a very basic topic, which is workup for the refractive surgery patient. I think what is most important is when you're working up the patient is that you choose the right patient for the right refractive surgery. Once you do that, your half your job is done, because as we all know, refractive surgeries are really easy to do. So what is more important is to know when not to operate, and also using the right technique, as in surface ablation. I think Dr. Namrata is talking about the various types of surgery. So what is whichever technique which if you choose the right technique for the right patient, I think you will definitely be happy. So if you don't want your refractive surgery patient reading like this, then do the right workup. I think workup begins with age. When the patient comes to you, this is the age range in which generally refractive surgery is done. If you're not talking about refractive cataract surgery, I'm talking about lens-based and cornea-based refractive surgery. So, in like, if you're looking at the older range of patients, then definitely make sure that you're looking for lens sclerosis, because if there is any existing lens sclerosis, then you don't want to do a cornea-based or even an ICL in that patient. The other factor, very important, is when the patient comes to you, look at all these social, psychosocial factors, like the occupation of the patient. If he's playing any contact sports, what are his visual needs? What are his personality? What is his personality type, and what is his expectations from surgery? Now, this is important because if the patient is coming and says he wants the same vision which he has in his contact lenses, without contact lenses, and after surgery he expects the same vision, it is fine. There will be some patients who will come and tell you that I want my vision to be better than what it is with contact lenses. Now, these are the patients you need to evaluate carefully, because you don't know whether they have some corneal aberration, why they're not happy with their current quality of vision with contact lenses. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Now, let's look at this patient. This was a refractive error. She wanted, she came for LASIK, and this was she was fit for LASIK also. Now, but her expectation was that she should be seeing it for distance without glasses, and also her notes which were kept at 1 feet distance, as she was a musician. So obviously in this patient, monovision, it would be a good option. So that is something which you should keep in mind. Now, looking at the younger range of patients, is there something which is too young? I think most of the ectasia cases, if you see, they're reported in the younger patients, and that is why I feel, as a thumb rule, it's better to wait till they're at least 21 before you go ahead for refractive surgery. When the patient comes to you, she's a female, make sure you've taken history about whether being on hormonal therapy, if they're planning any pregnancy immediately, all of that, because you know that they have a higher risk for a LASIK ectasia. Now, what about refractive error? The refractive error, typically, I feel maximum if the error is more than 10. I know, and as the practice pattern, till 12, 13 people do LASIK, but I feel if it's more than 10, I mean, I've written 8. I know that's probably too radical for many, but if it's more than 10 diopters, it's probably better to opt for a lens-based surgery, because even if you have adequate corneal thickness, because these patients are the ones who are going to keep coming with the night vision issues to you. And of course, hyperopia, astigmatism, we know, look at this. This is the range of refractive error that you are dealing with. Look at the patient, examine the ocular surface very well. This is very important. You rather do it before than after surgery than have a patient keeps coming back. So this is a patient, with recurrent dryness because of absence of the nerves, in the after LASIK. So look for all of these symptoms. Very easy to just give a questionnaire nowadays to the patient and find that. Examine the surface well. Look for any of these signs. Also, evert your lids and look at your meibomian glands. Look at your tear film, fluorescein staining. I think that will give you a good idea as to whether the patient has any dryness. Now, topography, I think the subsequent two speakers are speaking about it, so I'm really not going to talk much. I'm just going to rush through this. I think what is abnormal, I'm sure they'll cover in greater detail. I'm just going to talk in short, that early keratoconus, if there's formed crust obviously this we know is abnormal. But if there's an asymmetric bow tie, inferior corneal steepening, the increased posterior float values, if there are skewed radial axes, these sometimes may not be so easy to pick up. So, and also you look at your, of course, you look at your tomography map and your corneal thickness facial profile graph and look at, whether the patient is fit. Now, this patient looks fit if you look at just a topography map, but if you look at the tomography map, you can see that there is increased values on the posterior float. So this patient probably, now this is very obvious, I think, case of keratoconus, no one should be missing this. Now this again, I think when you're working up the patient and you directly put the patient on the topographer and you get something like this, again, this is where it's important to look at your history. If the patient has been wearing contact lenses for a long time, then contact lens warpage itself can cause that. So make sure that when you're working up the patient, you've told your the staff to tell them to, when the patient is coming for LASIK workup, to be off lenses for a minimum of 48 hours, preferably longer, preferably a week, and if it's rigid lenses, then definitely longer than that. Now, again, this is a patient which probably looks normal on topography, but if you see on tomography, it looks subnormal. So the next thing when you're looking at your patient's maps, looking at corneal thickness. Now, what is your cutoff? Now, say the patient has 450 microns. I mean, I remember someone had asked me this question. The patient has 420 microns and 450 microns and just -1 error. So should I go ahead with LASIK? So I think if you look at these, the published systems, you will see that if it's less than 480 and 500 microns, then there is an increased risk of exposure. So what is the risk? I mean, definitely I feel if it is less than 480, please do not do LASIK. You can go ahead with either a surface-based surgery, or you can go for a lens-based surgery. Now, this was a patient again with just 480 and -5 where we did PRK and she's doing very well. Now, when we look at RSB, there is leaving RSB of 300 microns adequate. Now, let us look at, we all know that we also need to look at PTA, which is the percentage of tissue ablated and not only at the RSB. This was a patient operated elsewhere where the LASIK in one arm was abandoned due to an incomplete plan. And left eye LASIK was done and the surgeon had actually planned for an undercorrection. This was the patient's, refractive error, and this was the plan in the patient surgeon's mind. Left eye is already done and right eye was a, abandoned surgery. This is the corneal thickness. Now the surgeon wanted to leave 300 microns behind and leave some amount of refractive error. I feel this kind of, planning while working up the patient is absolutely incorrect. This patient would have been an ideal patient for just ICL. Doing 11 diopters, doing undercorrection, it really does not help neither the patient nor us. So, make sure you're choosing your surgery properly. Now, corneal aberrations, it's again a whole topic in itself. If you have patient has corneal aberrations, these are the patients who are not going to be happy with their quality of vision. Like I said, even with lenses. So make sure you're looking for the aberrations. That will be a red flag that why are they not happy. When you look at aberrations, and you can use your Contura or your topo guided treatments for such patients. Also look for the pupil size of it. I'm just ending now. And again, this is a large topic in itself. If you're choosing a lens-based surgery, make sure you look at AC depth. Your sizing depends on your white to white. Either you can use sulcus to sulcus, white to white. Lens sizing depends on the AC depth. If the AC is shallow, then obviously you undersize the lens, and if it is deep, then you oversize it. So I think in conclusion, as practice patterns evolve, we know that if it's thinner corneas, then better to go for surface options and or for lens-based surgery. It's also important to to understand what your patient's needs are. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Kavita. Thank you for your comprehensive workup, letting us getting through the journey of workup. And hereby, I invite Dr. Saurabh for corneal topography pearls.
Yes, ma'am. Please allow me to share screen. Hello, am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Please allow me to share screen.
Technical team?
Yes, doctor.
Rao madam has to stop sharing screen. Only then I will be able to
Madam,
share.
just a minute. Hold on. 1 minute.
Technical team.
Yes, doctor, you can start sharing your screen, doctor.
It's not. Is my yes? Is my presentation
Yes.
visible, ma'am?
Yes, doctor.
Thank you. Thank you, Moss, for this opportunity. A very good afternoon. I will be talking on topographic pearls for evaluation of LASIK laser surgery. I will be continuing from where Rao madam has left. So we all know we are having OpScan map, Pentacam map, and other machines available to help us in evaluating the topographic curvatures of the patient. So all these machines basically they give anterior elevation, posterior elevation, the curvature and the pachymetry map and the statistical data. I think the posterior elevation is more of an artificially intelligence derived thing rather than a direct calculation. So one must keep that thing in mind. It can also be used in toric calculations and deep myopic eyes where you want to do cataract surgery. So these are the two common maps. My center is using this kind of maps. So I'm trying to correlate this thing. OpScan can be more or less everyone has the same feature. So first we start with a basic thing the entire LASIK preoperative workups roam around these three things. I call it a rat, which sometimes becomes a trap. So R is residual corneal thickness. One has to calculate how much they have to live. The A is for ablation, amount of ablation and the zone of ablation, and T is the thickness available on which we decide the flap size. So we will be evaluating a topographic pulse or nuggets in topography, not solo, but in combination with refractive error, pupil size, K readings, thickness, ocular health, and try to decide who are good and who are bad candidates. Before that, I always want to stress on, if you find one abnormal map, you proceed with caution. If you have two abnormal maps, you please take second opinion before even touching the patient. And if you find three abnormal maps, no need to ask anyone, just that is a contraindication. You can directly switch on to other options. So I call it a CCC for LASIK pre-evaluation. So here, this is a straightforward case where we have a keratoconus where the posterior elevation is also showing like a red mark. So this is a straightforward case of keratoconus, straightway rejected for LASIK. You can go for C3R or any other options depending on progression. This map is not showing the posterior elevation redness, but again, it is a keratoconus patient with a thin K and a steep K. This is a little dicey one. We'll call it a formifrostic keratoconus where the thickness is less. The K readings are on a steeper side, 48, 49. So we call it formifrostic keratoconus. It's much better to avoid such patients, as operating such patients can lead you into trouble. Then this is a patient with apparently normal thickness K readings. If you see like borderline, the trap here is the difference in the K reading, the 43, 48 K reading. So if you are using a blade procedure, it can result in buttonhole. So if possible, try to use a bladeless procedure or switch to some other modality. So this is island happiness, normal, absolutely normal map. So like depending on the number, you just go ahead with any type of procedures. This is how a normal map looks like. Now, coming to certain case-based topography. So we are trying to correlate the topography with the cases. So if you see here, the thickness is borderline 490 or less, as Rao madam has already pointed out in our presentation. Then K readings are also again, I will say, okay, like little borderline up, but okay, if numbers are less, depending on number and depending on how much residual corneal thickness is there, you can change the optical distinct zone. You can change the flap thickness. We are having 90, 110, and 130. So you can adjust accordingly and keep the residual thickness above 300. I preferably suggest to all basic LASIK surgeons to use 300 as the benchmark. Experts can go up to 280, never less than 280 for anyone. These are dicey cases where, if you see, we are having a thin K, then we are having a very steep K. Now, I know surgeons who operate such cases for PRK if the number is less. Since the number is like -2, so there will be surgeons who will be operating such kind of cases with PRK. It is their choice. Like if they are expert to handle post-operative, if they are able to pick up any ectasia post-operative at a very early stage, then definitely they can go ahead with such cases. Otherwise, avoid. Then this case, these are the rat cases. What the trap is there, like absolutely normal posterior reading, absolutely normal thickness. The flatness is there in the K reading. Now, if suppose the number is very high, like suppose the number is -8. So you remember for every diopter you are changing the K reading towards the flatter side, more flatter side. One must not go below 36 K reading. So depending on the number, such cases can become trouble in a post-operative period. So another absolutely normal looking case where anterior and posterior elevations are normal, thickness is very great, but the number is again extremely high, almost -12. There will be people who will say, okay, we will operate -9, leave -2 like that. I suggest in the era of ICL, clear lens exchange, smile procedures, and all other bladeless procedure, don't take such headaches. So better avoid such cases. This is a patient with a number is less, thickness. If the number is less, thickness is borderline. Like it's okay, thickness, K readings are normal. So if the number is less, I will always give a preference to PRK, as it can be adjustable in future also if the patient needs a second surgery. And depending on the number, like if individual choice, how much they go for PRK. So I keep myself restricted to -1 to -4. I know people who can go up to -6. Obviously, mitomycin C is being used, but in PRK, I will suggest every individual surgeon to use his and her comfort factor, how much you can handle the post-operative thing in the patient, and accordingly decide your own thing. So right from -1 to -6 range is available, but I have myself restricted to -4. The individual choice of comfort, your post-operative outcome, and how much patient satisfaction you give. So all depending on all these things, as we have discussed, along with topography. So excellent candidate will be the one who will be having a lesser number, normal pupil, and the K reading on a little steeper side, 44, 46 like that. Thick pachymetry and a symmetrical topometry, and a good ocular health. Bad candidate will be the one who is having very high myopia, because they generally tend to regress, or the one with a flatter K, because then the optical quality decreases. So accordingly, you have to correlate and customize your decision based on the individual topography and individual patient. So LASIK procedures are elective. So you do a meticulous and careful preoperative evaluation and selection of patients. You take a decision and customize your decision depending on patient, as well as your topography and other general ocular health. You try to match the patient's expectation to the clinical outcome, and always under promise rather than over. Yet complications do occur. Take second opinion, take help, and never fear to handle the complications. That's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Saurabh. Thank you for a colorful presentation. And
Thanks,
I guess Dr. Rohit, the next presenter,
Dr.
he is
Namrata.
yet to join.
Hello, Dr.
Yes, sir.
Namrata. Good morning, Dr. Kapoor.
Yes.
Yeah, I request to let Dr. Jayant speak next. Sarvate.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Actually, I'm advancing because I have some other commitments.
Yeah,
so
yeah. Please go ahead.
Allow
Please
me
go
to
ahead.
do.
Please go ahead,
Thank you.
Jayant.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. Please proceed.
Okay. I think no. He has to stop sharing.
Sir, yes, sir. I have stopped sharing.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you all for giving me this opportunity. Thank you, Master, for giving me this in advance. I would be basing on continuing this talk that LASIK, SBK, mechanical SBK, will be batting for that against the flapless procedure of today, that is SMILE. With better laser designs, optics and algorithms, tissue saving algorithms, the customized treatments, aspheric, for treatments, for higher order aberrations, and topo-guided treatments, for primary myopia, contura vision, the laser procedures, laser vision correction has become a very dependable job. Better eye trackers are available. Femtosecond flaps give you a better flap quality, and then comes the procedure. So the surface ablation from flapless I am removing because at present I am restricting myself to comparing our SBK platforms against the flapless platforms. LASIK is a conventional generic term which normally we don't do 150 to 170 microns because the thin is in is the current mantra, and SBK or the sub-Bowman's keratomyelitis is done all the time nowadays. It combines the advantages of LASIK like faster visual recovery, painless procedure with advantages of surface ablation like safety, biomechanical stability of cornea, and it also avoids the disadvantages of surface ablation like haze and regression. It creates for customized corneal flap from 90 to 110 microns, and with a mechanical microkeratom, a more planar flap rather than a meniscus flap of a LASIK. So this is the comparison between the flaps, and the electron micrograph from the femtolasic and SBK with Moria. It seems more smoother with my mechanical one because of the spacing of the laser spots in the femto. But nowadays with faster lasers available, so this has been minimized. So these are the procedures, SBK as well as femto with a FS200 platform. I usually try to take the pachymetry. If somebody asks, I will go into that. Nowadays, the femto platform flaps also can go easily well because of the good quality femto which are available. So these are some of the SBK flaps ASOCT images which will consistently show planar platform of 102 to 107, variation of about 6 microns at all. So 110 flap thickness gives you a predictable 109 to 112 micron thickness flap, which is again a planar. Difficulties in SBK, chances of free flaps are in steeper corneas. I think they are very rare. Complications associated with flap niggling, yes. In a small percentage, we have to settle these wrinkles early, and dislodgement of flap, that happens once in a while, but that also can be treated. If you mark the flap early, then we can align these flaps without giving any other flap related complications. A femtolasic, completely bladeless creation of the flap, which decreases the complication rates like free flap, buttonholing. Precisely personalized thicknesses of flap can be planned as low as 90 microns. Deviations are very minimal to the 2 to 4 microns, and it is a completely planar flap and comparatively less dryness, and that too for a very shorter duration is achieved with the help of a femtosecond flap than mechanical SBK. A femtosecond LASIK, two separate laser platforms, femto and examiner laser, are required. Overall surgery takes longer than traditional SBK, mechanical SBK thing, and slightly slower recovery of the vision is because of the laser incision leads to minimal degree of corneal edema, which settles within 24 to 48 hours. RELAX SMILE, I am just giving a passing mention, and it's a flapless procedure which can give rise to lesser incidence of dry eye, and there is no corneal biomechanics which has been compromised because there is no flap which has been created. The limitations of RELAX SMILE: high cost of equipment and consumables. It lacks the cyclotorsion control limiting its use in high astigmatism. Now, this is also been addressed to in recent versions. Topo-guided and wavefront-guided treatments are not possible. And now, with the newer software, some of these corrections like high astigmatic corrections and hyperopic corrections have been addressed too. But these are having less predictable results as against mechanical SBK or LASIK platforms. No flap means subsequent enhancement has to be done on the surface, and you may have to do a side cut with the software, and that means convert this into LASIK. That means it defeats the purpose of doing SMILE. SBK, I having SBK for 80% of my cases from -3 to -10. No, I don't go beyond -10. And with experience of about 8,000 eyes, I very consistently get thin flaps about 100 to 110 microns and a variation of 6 to 10 microns. My unbiased opinion is LASIK or SBK is a mature technology which is still being refined all the time. Many of the most important developments have already taken place, like advanced or customized ablation profiles for most types of refractive errors, including pulse errors, advanced eye tracking in 6 dimensions, fast laser pulse repetition rates, cyclotorsion control. So RELAX is still a procedure in evolution with many issues which have been already addressed to and continue to get addressed. The better biomechanical stability argument pro SMILE has also turned out to be a relatively equivocal, as many studies show no significantly better biomechanics in SMILE as compared to flap procedures. So my opinion is thin with good safety and precisely predictable thinner flaps. SBK minimally compromises the corneal biomechanical stability to reducing the chances of ectasias. I hardly had 1 or 2 cases of in last 20 years with my LASIK practices. SBK expands the range of treatment, especially in cases of the thin corneas, and much economical alternative. RELAX SMILE is definitely superior technically and theoretically, but SBK and femto-SBK laser procedures are still preferred procedures in majority centers, and now advanced surface ablation is regaining its charm lately. So RELAX SMILE is a costly alternative to advanced form of LASIK. RELAX SMILE is economically viable only if you have a very high volume of patients, and I would like to prefer to do good topo-guided SBK or femto-SBK in majority of my cases, and ASA when SBK is contraindicated. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for advancing my, because I have to go somewhere. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for sharing tips and your experiences as well. And
Okay.
the battle begins. Flap versus flapless versus, you know, and I'm sure Natasha will
be all-
add some more.
It will always be there.
Yes, yes. So for today, it has begun, I would say.
Yes, yes.
So I would request Dr. Natasha to throw some more light on biomechanics part. So let's take battle a bit forward to next level.
Are my slides visible?
Yes.
Well, after initiating a battle, I'm just here to justify my need for a role of surgery. But before that, I would like to thank MOSCON and the organizing committee, and a humble thanks Dr. Vardhaman Kankaria and Dr. Ragini ma'am for giving me this humbling opportunity. So let's just see, why do we need corneal biomechanics in refractive? Look at the current standards, our screening standards. If a patient already discussed doing. But what it essentially does is it looks at the structure. So topography, for instance, which is the first test that we would do for a refractive patient. So let me put this into perspective by a clinical example. A patient who's an ophthalmologist, comes to me with a smaller refractive error, wants refractive correction, slit lamp examination is absolutely normal. But if you look at a topography, there is superior inferior asymmetry, elevation back. Now, if you look at the superior inferior asymmetry, also if you look at the bad D, the total bad D is 1.56 and the suspicious range is 1.60, which is not too far away from it being suspicious. Furthermore, on the position, there is some amount of elevation that is seen. So is this patient really fit for refractive surgery or not? And I wish I had some more data to back me up if for a refractive surgery for a smaller refractive error. So what I'm essentially trying to say by criteria are there, they are not probably as sensitive and specific enough for us to actually go boldly into considering refractive surgery. Now, what is that factor that we are looking at? Now, imagine these two blocks of different materials have the same size and shape. Which of these would you feel is slightly stronger? Obviously, the one, the iron one is apparently looks stronger. Why is this? Is because it is because of the innate material property. What that structure from topography, but we get the function of the innate property from what is called in cornea as a Young's modulus. Now, this is basically a surrogate marker for corneal biomechanics. A true way of measuring Young's modulus is currently in clinic. What essentially Young's modulus does is basically if the cornea is stiffer, the Young's modulus is lesser. If the cornea is slightly more compliant, more softer, to say, the Young's modulus is higher. Now, this function in the clinic is given by two clinically available tools, which are Ocular Response Analyzer or ORA and Corvus ST. Let's look at both of them step by step. The first one is the ORA, which essentially was the first tool which was giving the corneal biomechanics in terms of corneal hysteresis. So it is basically the property of the cornea to rebound back, elastic property that was being measured. But this is again not the true corneal biomechanics. This is just a surrogate reading that we get. The other clinically available tool is that actually does is it's a high speed Scheimpflug camera, which basically after application by an air puff takes a video and it transfers it into this data analysis and tells us how strong or how weak the cornea is in terms of its capacity to deform. Now, what it essentially does is initially the plain Corvus had a tool which was called as a deformation amplitude, and that was the only measurement that we were taking earlier. It also gave us the first and second application methods, which were high speed image tracking of the cornea. But the newer device is giving us what is called as the Corneal Biomechanics Index, or the CBI. It is proposed by the Vinciguerras. Essentially, after a regression analysis, it gives us how strong the cornea is. It also gives us the corneal compensated, not only the corneal compensated, but the biomechanically compensated or corrected IOP, which is slightly more robust than the corneal compensated IOP. Another feature of this is what is called as the best display. What it essentially does is help with the speed of the camera. It helps us decide the progression of the disease, which we'll discuss a little bit later. And the most advanced function of this is what is called as TBI. Now it catches the structure and function together and gives us what is a total biomechanics index, which is from the Pentacam and the Corvus together. So what does this TBI basically do is, if we look at an individual parameter as the corneal biomechanics index, which is from the Corvus, or the BAD D from Pentacam, they are significantly specific or sensitive. But if you look at the ROC curves for TBI, it is much, much, much more sensitive and specific when it comes to screening for ectasia. So essentially what we have done is combine the structure and function together. Now, what are the factors that affect corneal biomechanics? Most importantly, we see that the corneal collagen cross-linking also affects the strength of the cornea, which essentially says that after cross-linking, the cornea becomes slightly more stiffer, which is the intention of cross-linking. Other important factor is the age, which is why ectasia risk scoring system also considers age. So corneal biomechanics becomes stronger, or the cornea becomes more stiffer with age. These are the factors which are already compensated for in a factor for which it compensates for the age as well of the patient. Now, the new best displays, basically what it essentially does is it gives us a progression of, it can be just progression of looking if the patient is progressing in terms of keratoconus or how thick or how strong the cornea is. It helps us measure the corneal biomechanics post cross-linking or post refractive surgery per se. So it's a very good tool if you're looking at the progression aspect of it, which was not mentioned earlier in terms of corneal biomechanics. Now let's come to actually how do we apply this in the clinic today. Step one, when we started doing SMILE surgery, we looked, everybody said that SMILE is more, as was already debated also by Dr. Sarbate, that SMILE is biomechanically more robust. But what we essentially notice is that it is not only true in terms of that, but it also depends on how strong the cornea is, and it helps us decide as to is the dissection going to be easier or difficult. So if the cornea is stronger, obviously the dissection is slightly more difficult, but if the cornea is very weak and the deformation amplitude is very high, then the dissection is very easy because it's a softer cornea. And this paper was published in the Journal of Cornea. Here is one very, very good example. This patient was actually seen long back by my father, and I just borrowed this case from him. So this patient was a 22-year-old female who came for refractive surgery. She was refused by my father for refractive surgery simply because of corneal hysteresis was 6.8. Now for refractive surgery, you would want a corneal hysteresis anywhere about 8.5. So because of this, she was refused for refractive surgery, but she went ahead and got surgery done elsewhere. She underwent PRK for a smaller refractive error, but she came back with ectasia immediate post-operative. I mean, at least 8 months post-operatively when she visited us. So essentially, when the topography is normal, there is an innate factor which we still need to consider for certain cases. And this was an example that was screaming at us that, corneal hysteresis or corneal biomechanics should be considered as a routine preoperative investigation. Here's another example, a 19-year-old female. We sent her back. She wanted refractive surgery. We sent her back simply because she was 19 at that time. We wanted her to turn 21. She sent her topography in 2011 from Lucknow, saying that, is it okay to undergo surgery now? My number has changed only by 0.25. We told her, come whenever you have time. She was lost to follow up. Without any surgery, in 2018, she sent this topography and she said, my number has slightly increased. Can I go for refractive surgery? So over a period of 10 years, a normal corneal topography turns into ectasia, which is keratoconus. Now imagine if we would have measured corneal biomechanics in 2008 or 2011, we would have been in a condition to say if the patient's cornea is weak or not. So this is essentially akin to what we call as pre-perimetric glaucoma. Before the perimetry picks up or before the topography picks up ectasia, the biomechanics is able to pick up ectasia in certain cases or weaker corneas for that matter. Now these functional tools are not available to everyone in the clinic. So there is a surrogate marker. This paper has been worked by Dr. Jyoti Matalia and Dr. Himanshu Matalia from Narayan Netral. And it's a very good paper. They worked in pediatric population. What they've essentially done is they've measured corneal biomechanics and they have simulated this to the entire eyeball. Now, why is that? Is because the scleral rigidity is the same as that of the cornea because it's the similar type of collagen. So they have essentially looked at it with mathematical modeling. They found that the deformation amplitude is higher. That means the cornea is slightly weaker in higher grades of myopia, and this was constant in all higher grades of myopia, and they measured it with the Young's modulus. So it essentially based.
Dr. Natasha, I would like to request you
the last
to
slide.
wrap up in a minute's time. Yeah.
This is the last slide. So essentially with this formula, they let us know if the cornea is weaker or without the need of having Corvus ST or having ORA simply by measuring the ocular biometry. So essentially just by measuring the axial length of these patients, we will be able to determine if the patient's cornea is weaker or is stronger and can be considered for refractive surgery or not. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take questions if there are any.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Natasha, for a classy, curvy presentation, I would say. And you have primed all of us for physics. So let's jump to some more physics. That is biophysics. I would request Dr. Ridhima to take over for biophysics of laser.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Just will share my screen. Is it visible, ma'am?
Yes, it's
Okay.
visible.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to present the biophysics of excimer laser. It's a very theoretical topic, but I think it's important that the surgeon is aware of the advantages of the laser that he's using and also its limitations and the available options that one has while using his laser machine. So basically, excimer laser was introduced for corneal use in 1983 by Trochelle and Srinivasan. So excimer stands for excited dimer. That means an energized state of a molecule with exactly two similar components. So in ophthalmology, we use the argon fluoride laser commonly that operates at 193 nanometers wavelength. This wavelength is important because the cornea absorbs a wavelength less than 350 nanometers. It transmits wavelength between like 400 to 1600 nanometers. So argon laser, YAG laser gets transmitted. However, this wavelength particularly will get absorbed by the cornea, and hence it has the ability, the laser, to reshape the cornea by a process called photoablation. So what is photoablation? In the energized state, this argon fluoride mixture, like the electrons jump to a higher orbit, if we remember a little bit of physics, and this is unstable. When they come back to the lower energy state, a photon of light is emitted. This photon of laser energy is capable of breaking the carbon-carbon and carbon-nitrous bonds in the corneal collagen. And this has the ability to actually cause molecular fragments in the cornea to get ejected at a very high speed. So a single pulse of this photon energy can remove 0.25 microns of tissue. And we know that if we want to do an ablation by the Muller-Lin formula, that the amount of ablation required depends on the power and the square of the optic zone that we are treating. So if we want to correct, say, a 6 diopter of myopia, that and a 6 millimeter optic zone, that would mean 6 into 6 into 6 divided by 3. So almost 72 microns we need to remove. So with one pulse of laser light, we are removing 0.25 microns. That means we need 540 such pulses to correct a 6 diopter of myopia. And in such a short treatment time, imagine that many pulses of laser energy have to be delivered. So basically, your laser machine, the excimer laser that you're using, has a gas reservoir. It could be a premix of argon fluoride or two separate chambers. And from the gas reservoir, there's a laser cavity. And this chamber actually amplifies this excitation effect. So with some electrical energy that is exciting your gas mixture, there are these convex mirrors that are going to amplify this excitation effect. And then a monochromatic radiation is emitted from your laser cavity. So your machine not only has the laser cavity, but there's an optical delivery system after that. That is like a series of prisms and mirrors that homogenizes and equalizes the energy of your laser beam and also reshapes it to your desired configuration. And this delivery system is then coupled with a surgical microscope. There's also a suction system available to pump out the effluent that is generated. It is usually coupled with an eye tracker or iris recognition device to ensure centration of your treatment. Other devices like the topographer or the abrometer can be linked to your device, and there's always a computer screen where we can decide what type of treatment we want. We can program your optic zone and the delivery treatment. So these are all your components of the excimer laser machine. The laser energy that is measured, it is described in terms of fluence. That means millijoules per centimeter square. And the minimum threshold is about 50 millijoules for photoablation to actually occur. In ophthalmic practice, usually the laser machines emit 120 and 180 millijoules. The range is that for the fluence of a machine. And as you know that the fluence has to be checked before every treatment to ensure that the energy delivery is as expected. So we usually use either metal foils or PMMA plates. this fluence is also affected by external factors. So the humidity of your OR has to be between 35 to 65%, or the temperature settings between 60 to 80 Fahrenheit, so that the fluence is and your ablation depth is as per expected. So the laser beam that is finally emitted by your machine can have either a homogeneous configuration or a Gaussian or reverse Gaussian profile. And what does that mean? So this is the Gaussian profile, wherein the energy density of the fluence is maximum at the center of the beam and drops towards the periphery, whereas a homogeneous has a fluence that is equally distributed at all points. So the earlier configurations had a top hat or a homogeneous pattern. So right at the bottom here, you see the figure wherein if the spots are slightly misplaced, or top hat configuration can lead to like an irregular treatment, whereas the Gaussian pattern, even if there's slight displacement of the spots, it still gives a more regular or smoother ablation profile. So the first generation laser beams were broad beams. That means that they required diaphragms or masking devices so that a broad beam of laser was emitted and the cornea was removed layer by layer. So these were fast treatments with high energy output. However, the advantages were that there were no blend zones, like there were small optic zones and the quality of vision could be affected. And also because there was a high energy output, there could be thermal effects like central islands and hot and cold irregular spots. So the next generation was scanning slit mechanisms, wherein a diaphragm was configuring the laser beam as a rectangular pattern, and then this was distributed over the cornea in a rotatory or linear fashion, like the Nidec uses the scanning slit. But nowadays we have like complex treatment profiles are possible by splitting this rectangle into smaller divisions. The latest, what we commonly use now, is the flying spot pattern, wherein small
Is there any technical glitch? Dr. Ridhima is not audible.
Yes, not audible, madam. I think the audio cut off.
Yeah, meanwhile, if anyone has...
Yes, ma'am, I think there was a technical glitch.
Fine. Dr.
Yeah,
Ridhima,
sorry,
please continue.
Yeah, sorry for the interruption. So what we commonly use now are the flying spot beam profiles, and what they cause is like more treatment time is required, but we can get more accurate treatments with these. Even a combination of broad beam and flying spot called the variable spot is possible with lasers nowadays. So the repetition rate of these laser pulses is important because that determines the treatment time. So typically, if it's like a very slow repetition rate, the cornea may dry up or there may be loss of fixation. Whereas if the repetition rate is too high, then there could be thermal effects. So modern devices now that use flying spots, they will deliver these spots at different locations so that there's not that much thermal buildup during the profile. Also, laser beams, when they are usually perpendicular only at the corneal apex, while they usually are oblique at the periphery, and that would lead to the treatment being spread out over a larger area and a lower fluence towards the periphery. So there could be undercorrections at the periphery, and this could also be an issue in hyperopic treatments. So nowadays, what we prefer are aspheric profiles, wherein that those compensate for undercorrection at the periphery. So the conventional treatments that we were using, we used to only take into account the sphere and the cylinder of the patient that we were treating. However, this is like the pre-op wavefront data of a patient. After a myopic treatment, we are making the prolate cornea oblate, and that causes not just an increase in the higher order aberrations, but specifically an increase in the positive spherical aberration. Conversely, in hyperopia, there's an increase in the negative spherical aberration. And that would cause, this is how a positive spherical aberration translates to practically how a patient would see the street light at night, or if there was an increase in coma or increase in trefoil. So compromising the quality of vision with LASIK is what led to customized ablations. And the first generation was wavefront guided treatments, wherein aberrometers used to measure the higher order aberrations of the eye, and we tried to correct not just the refraction of the patient, but tried to correct the measured higher order aberrations. But the results were not as fulfilling because an eye has its natural set of aberrations. And now what we commonly use are wavefront optimized treatments. That means that we are not correcting the pre-existing aberrations of the eye, but we are ensuring that our treatment is not increasing these aberrations drastically. So aspheric
Dr.
treatment.
Ridhima, I would like to request you to wrap up.
Sure, ma'am. So another last important component is eye tracking. That is extremely important for these customized aberrations, wherein we need to not just recognize movements of the eye, but reposition the laser before the next pulse. And iris registration is again an important component that has helped us with that. This talk is sponsored by Carl Zeiss, and I do use their refractive suite. So the Visumax for Relax Smile and the MEL 80. The MEL 90 is the successor to the MEL 80 Excimer that gives even faster treatments. I'm extremely satisfied with their predictability, safety of the results. So thank you very much for your attention and time. I'm sorry for the technical glitch in between.
Thank you, Ridhima, for taking us through evolution of lasers. And
My
so
pleasure.
with your permission, Dr. Kapoor sir, I would
Yes,
like
madam.
to start with my presentation.
Please, madam. Thank you so much.
Is my presentation visible?
No.
I am already sharing it.
Yes,
Is it
ma'am.
visible?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Thank
Visible.
you. So again to the battlefield. Let's start. Though my job already has been made easy by some of the presenters, and we are going to get details of each procedure in subsequent talks also. So the end game for spectacles begin here. We do have many heroes, or I would say heroes and heroines also. What to choose, what to select, and comprehensive overview of everything might not be possible in lieu of time, but I would definitely like to focus on some of the commonly practiced and important options. So let's target myopia, hyperopia, and astigmatism. Presbyopia, we might probably discuss a bit of it. So let's begin with a well-known and mature player. Nonetheless, Captain America. Who is our Captain America? It's LASIK. So as all of you know, in LASIK is a flap-based surgery and microkeratome is used. Based on which generation microkeratome you are using, hinge location and hinge configuration would change. And after lifting the flap, excimer laser delivery will be done and flap repositioning will be done. So let's discuss what are our pluses and minuses. Early or fast visual recovery is probably with the help of 48 randomized controlled trials, it has been proved that LASIK is still the fastest one as far as visual recovery is considered. Very minimal tissue reaction, less discomfort, of course, as compared to PRK, no haze formation as that of PRK. Pre-treatments and touch-up can be done. But at the same time, it's a weakening procedure as far as biomechanics is considered. And flap-related complications. 1 in 10,000 to 15,000 population undergoing LASIK, the global prevalence is prevalence of complication, flap-related complication is there. So here comes generation next, some improvisation. As this is femto LASIK, the blade is not there. It is bladeless, less flap-related complications, planar flap, previous speaker has already addressed some of the advantages of femtoLASIK. Customization of hinge location is possible, as well as flap thickness, and less chances of epithelial ingrowth in long run, and lower suction IOP as compared to LASIK, microkeratome LASIK. It comes with its own unique set of complications as well. One of it I would like to mention is opaque bubble layer. We do get soft OBL as well as hard OBL. These days, with the energy levels going down with the newer generation of machines, we hardly get hard OBL. These are soft OBLs, which vanishes in few minutes. At times, there can be entry of gas bubble intracamerally. In that case, iris tracking might be an issue. We might have to wait a little longer. Rest of complications which are being mentioned, the prevalence is really going down with the energy usage, which is going down with the newer machines. Let's smile. Here is a reason to smile. As Dr. Natasha already has addressed, biomechanics is an important factor which should be addressed pre-op, post-op. So here comes our soldier who is good with biomechanics, who maintains biomechanics better than LASIK and femtoLASIK. So this is, as the name suggests, small incision lenticule extraction, where something similar to our SICS, but this, of course, this is femtolaser assisted. The dissection part is being done and the lenticule is extracted. I think my videos are not running fine anyways. So this is our Iron Man indeed, because our biomechanical strength is retained better than LASIK and femtoLASIK. So it has advantages of smaller incision, we have already discussed, less transection of nerve, so less induced dry eye. Flapless, so no flap related complications obviously, and we have already discussed. The foremost is better biomechanical strength. As far as higher order aberrations are concerned, there is some controversy also. With high myopia treated with SMILE, vertical coma can be induced. So what are cons of SMILE? It has steep learning curve. It comes with unique set of its complication again. There can be incomplete lenticule extraction, retained fragments, iatrogenic stromal scarring, especially for the learners, interface irregularities, and cyclotorsion compensation is a limitation. And hyperopic treatment is still under evaluation. So at the moment, only myopia and astigmatism can be treated. And very important, cost, which is an important factor as far as developing country is considered. So many studies you will find online on PubMed, but one of the study which I found was very systematic, and they have compared contralateral eyes. One eye was treated with SMILE, contralateral eye was treated with femtoLASIK. So all the confounding factors were taken care. It proved that both the options are equally safe, efficacious, and predictable at the end of even 5 years follow. Here comes PRK. PRK is unique in itself. We do have different techniques to removal of epithelium, right from alcohol, blunt instrument, a Moyle's brush to PTK mode. But the uniqueness lies, this is flapless and good option for thinner corneas, as Dr. Saurabh has already discussed about it. It comes with a cost of discomfort, longer visual recovery, less predictability, prolonged tissue remodeling, and haze formation, though mitomycin takes care of haze partly, I would say. Here comes our Thor. Why this is Thor? Our ICL or phakic IOL implantation is a Thor because this is, as Thor is from different planet, this comes non-cornea based surgery. Rest of all were cornea based surgeries, what we have discussed. This is intraocular surgery, smaller wound, fast recovery, maintains contrast, wider range of correction, and thinner corneas, LASIK rejects can be addressed. No issue of dry eye. But of course, the risk involved is also probably magnanimous. Risk of endophthalmitis, loss of endothelial counts, cataract, raised IOP can occasionally be found based on a lower or higher vaults, and cost, of course, is one of the limiting factor. Prerequisite ACD is one of the limitation, especially in hyperopes where shallow ACD is found. I'll wrap up in a minute's time, sir. Refractive lens exchange, yes. So here comes Hulk. It's really a mighty option, but we have to be very cautious because it comes with a cost. It comes with a cost, at the cost of higher risk of retinal detachment, higher risk. So we have to be cautious in selecting the cases, but it can correct really very high refractive errors, LASIK, ICL rejects also, and presbyopia correction can also be done. Other options, these are really less used and very high complication rate. This is one emerging option which has been discussed in the previous session by Dr. Vikas, enhancement or additive procedure. And this is something which is still practiced, that is bioptics, addition of any two technologies, especially ICL plus PRK when refractive error is on higher side, when it can't be addressed with one technology. So here comes our second hero in play, when first hero can't complete the task. This is a comprehensive slide which compares all the pros and cons of each procedure. As we do have a lot of weapons and heroes with us, now the magical role is of doctor. I won't say Dr. Strange, now it's Dr. Familiar, doctor who is familiar with all the technologies and knows what to select to deliver the best. Thank you. And I would like to thank Dr. Vardhaman, Dr. Sumit, all MOS organizers. I would also like to thank all of presenters for the session. Thank you.
As we wrap up, thank you very much, Dr. Kapoor sir, and all the friends who have agreed to be part of this MOSCON refractive session. I think it was amazing to listen to all the talks. I'm currently traveling from Bangalore to go to Mysore, but I think it was a very academic travel. Thank you again, everybody, and we see you for the next session of refractive at 2 o'clock. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Vardhaman. Thank you, everyone.